Hello, I'm Soycat, and welcome back to the second channel geography video. Today I wanted to talk about Vietnam, and specifically its borders, because it is one of the most oddly shaped countries in the world. It's incredibly tall, yet super thin, making it a very skinny country, one where you can go from the coast to the border in about 50 miles or less, 50 kilometers or less in some cases, one where you can go from the first biggest city to the second biggest city, and if you were to take a direct route, you would go through two countries. That is very rare across the world, but even more rare is the fact that it's one of just 4 countries in the world that still describes itself as socialist. This means that because it borders 2 of the other 4, China and Laos, it is actually the socialist country that borders the most other socialist countries, or sort of tied for that, and then the third country that it borders by land is Cambodia, which goes the exact opposite way and is officially a kingdom. So the Kingdom of Cambodia, the 2 socialist republics, are the 3 countries that Vietnam borders by land, but then it borders maybe 3 others by sea. I mean, Vietnam can't tell you exactly, which is weird to say, but it's one of those situations where most countries know their maritime borders, but if Vietnam were to officially say, they might really upset their neighbor to the north. We'll dive into all of that and more later, but first let's explain how Vietnam got so ridiculously thin, because despite being a country that looks like it should be dysfunctional by the shape, Vietnam is incredibly rich in terms of culture, population, and indeed is growing a lot in terms of economically, because it is a country that officially, to go through the very short history, it is a country that officially went through a lot of turmoil very recently. You probably heard something about it, but to go way back, the reason Vietnam exists is because it is a group of very similar Austro-Asiatic people. However, if you look at this map over modern day borders, you can see there's a lot of other countries that are Austro-Asiatic, and indeed this is why they were all merged together into one colony of Indochina. So Indochina, halfway between India and China, I guess, was made up of 5 separate major areas, and it was a colony which went the exact same way as most other colonies in the 20th century, where the main power got bankrupted after World War II. Colonialism fell out of favor anyway, and so they slowly went independent, except, it's a French colony, so they actually fought a huge war over it instead. They used a lot of bullets and guns and bombs to try and keep the Indochina under their control, but it didn't work, and so instead, the 5 parts of Indochina broke up into being Laos, Cambodia, and then the other 3 parts joined together to make the modern-day state of Vietnam. And so almost all of these simple border things you can explain are the French did it. Like most terrible things in the world, you can blame it on the French if you want to. However, this is also the reason why Vietnam has a very big baguette culture. It should be mentioned, the whole banh mi is just, combining Vietnamese ingredients with a French baguette, which is always hilarious to me because it is one of the great cuisines of the East, right? But anyway, with that said, the thing that's important to mention with that whole thing is that Vietnam was one country. These 3 places did join together into one, but then someone said, just looking at this, country and seeing that there are 2 major cities at the time, Hanoi and Saigon, really this is looking at a population density map. I see how, I just look at it and I think we should clearly be 2 separate countries. And so what they did is they split the country in half. Wow, that was exactly the reason they did it. The north just happened to be communist and the south happened to be capitalist. And obviously if you followed the Cold War for one of its installments, you'll know that the capitalists won that one, except not in this case. The communists took over the south, and the reason that's so important to mention is because 1, Saigon got renamed to Ho Chi Minh City after the biggest communist leader in Vietnam at the time, but 2, it's because a lot of the communist fighters who were coming from the north to the south actually went across to Cambodia. This meant that the US had to bomb a lot of Cambodia. It feels like that might be a war crime, but the US had to bomb Cambodia to get these fighters, but it also means that Cambodia was real sick of these, South Vietnamese war fighters at the end, and so when the war ended, they tried to get some concessions by invading Vietnam, which is why the border has changed a few times since those French days, but mostly when you look over this border, you can see it's an old border just by zooming into basically anywhere. To give you an example, if we go all the way over here, you look into the border and you can see it's very squiggly. This is usually a sign of a river border. However, look at the river right now, and even on Google Maps you can see there are places where the river clearly used to go longer, and then path of least resistance, the river's changed. And so if you look on Google Maps, the Earth view, you can see this very clearly. Yep, there used to be a river there, and now it goes over here. You can see interestingly that even though the river's here now, the 2 countries have a border which looks like it goes partially through the forest. So there is part of the land on this side which might be Cambodian instead of Vietnamese, despite the river being a clear dividing point. And so in reality, this probably wouldn't ever matter unless they find oil on one side of this river, which they're obviously not going to. And so in reality, the border between Cambodia and Vietnam mostly follows rivers, with some interesting exceptions. You'll notice every now and then the border goes into a big straight line between 2 sections. One of the biggest examples would be over here. This is because if it follows rivers and natural borders like mountains and stuff, whenever there are 2 natural borders that meet but don't have a direct direct line between them, they just draw a very big straight line. Because the official way that the border is drawn is not based on the river. It's not that the river defines the border. Instead, it's a series of points. So this is a border point, 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 which means that even though the river has curves in it, the border officially does not. In reality, it shouldn't make a very huge difference for most cases, but again, it's one of those things that has been very much negotiated time after time after time. And what's interesting is because Vietnam borders 3 other countries, 2 of those countries also border each other, and that leads to the fun situation of a border right here where they all touch together. I think this is a very cool little spot, and I think we should be able to street view it even. You can see this is the point where Laos meets Cambodia meets Vietnam. Interestingly enough, I should also mention before we leave it, the whole South Vietnam, North Vietnam thing meant that because the north-south border was drawn nearby Laos, Cambodia only ever used to border South Vietnam, and so relations have actually improved since the country came together and they started working on cross-border trade, because all 3 of these nations are part of ASEAN, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and so they're trying to lower friction across the border as much as they can, which is why every border checkpoint between Vietnam and Laos, they do have official checkpoints. They have proper ways for goods to flow across it. A lot of countries, you know, when you picture strong borders, you picture real big fences and stuff like that. A lot of countries treat it a lot more kind of, you leave, then you're just going to cause yourself legal issues. But in the case of the Vietnam-Laos border, you can see every single one of their major border checkpoints has a proper way across and a legal way to do it, which is actually surprisingly good for trade. Having a legal way to do all those things is good. But what is very interesting to me is despite the fact that Laos borders Vietnam and they've been working a lot on their friendship, in fact, while looking into this video, I found this fairly fun. No, I didn't find this fairly fun. I mean, this is fairly fun in that it shows Vietnam is very much a South Vietnam and a North Vietnam now, in terms of its population. But I found this, which was quite interesting, which is basically Laos and Vietnam have these super close ties. They have similar systems of government. They've got friends all over, and they have a 25-year treaty of friendship and cooperation. But they've been trying to work out how to increase trade as much as they can. But it does mean that every now and then they are slightly demarcating the border in slightly different ways, which means that although it mostly follows the French Laotian path, it has very slightly changed in incredibly minor ways that give small bits of land back and forth here and there, which is why it's weird to see that, you know, when you look at the border between, if you look at the border between, say, Cambodia and Vietnam, it's very, very old and both sides are still a little bitter about it, whereas when you look at the border between Laos and Vietnam, it actually functions just great. Instead of saying it's a bunch of points and we're fighting over every individual point, the border can follow the river quite naturally, which means if there ever was to be an issue on one side of the river, it wouldn't cause them fun issues. So, yeah, that is the border between Laos and Vietnam, which is a very interesting one in my opinion, but nowhere near as interesting as this place in Myanmar. Nowhere near as interesting as the fact that from the border crossings between Vietnam and its neighboring countries are actually used very heavily by people trying to get. It's called a border run. You might not be familiar with it if you haven't checked out the region before, but a lot of people live in the region kind of semi-illegally, and because it's not that big of a concern, you know, Vietnam just says once your visa runs out, you just have to leave the country. You're allowed to leave the country just to go to Cambodia. So this is a popular spot right here where you can be in a Vietnamese town. You can cross over to Cambodia. You can do whatever you want and then come right the way back. It's very rare to have actual settlements on both sides of the border, especially Vietnam being so centered. But one of the cases where this happens is in the north border with China. So this is right over here, this is Lao Cai. This is a fairly big Vietnamese city right here. It's got a happy farm. What more do you need? Look how happy the farm is. But interesting enough, it's like a full-on Vietnamese city. But then there's a fairly medium-sized Chinese town on this side, right? Look, there's a Chinese restaurant. You only find Chinese restaurants in China. That's a fact you can trust. But when you look at the border between them, there is only one bridge. The Street View says there's more than one bridge, but China deliberately messes with its GPS data so you can't see around the country just because they don't want people to know what's going on there. But yeah, you can see that the border crossing between them using actual Street View bubbles is very, very interesting. Although this is people on one side of the bridge very much not being allowed to the other side. But if we look a little closer, you can see something really, really quirky, which is they have this bridge where you do your border crossing. One of the officials here, then you can walk across it. But when you walk across to the Vietnamese side, you're greeted by like, oh yeah, welcome to Vietnam. It's all nice. When you walk across to the Chinese side, you're greeted with giant pictures of Xi Jinping. I was worried like, oh, is this maybe not Xi Jinping? And I saw this one, and I'm pretty damn sure they're like, yes, China welcomes you. And that is just absolutely fascinating to me, that there is a bridge you can walk across, and this is officially what you gotta do, but it's a very, 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 very weird interaction, because these are two countries that very much had a split in their relations. Unlike, like Laos and Vietnam, which have had their friendship treaty forever, although I should say, just to be fair here, they are good friends and they do a little bit of trade, but Laos clearly is better friends of China, because here's what the train to China looks like. Wow, modern, fast. And here's what the train to Vietnam looks like. Wow, that looks like it might technically go places. It's just a fun little comparison there, right? China, Vietnam. Do you want to go to China or do you want to go to Vietnam? It's maybe just interesting to me. But what's also incredibly interesting to me is the fact that, Vietnam has relationships with China, which have always led to a bit of controversy. China is very much an expansionist state, and Vietnam is kind of cautious of that in a lot of ways. But more interestingly is the fact that if you actually look at the territories, if we go back to the Austronesian people, the north of Vietnam and the south of China actually have a lot more similarities with each other than you might expect. A lot of people picture there is one type of Vietnamese person. It's probably because someone went from Saigon, or now Ho Chi Minh City, or they went from Hanoi or Da Nang or whatever. There's someone who lives in this fairly monocultured place, which is what you might imagine. But when you get to the really regional parts of somewhere, when you get further and further from a nation's center, you get some very unique people. I mean, for example, the languages they speak in this part of China are very far removed from the language they speak on the east. They merge it all together in one language, but it doesn't really work that way. And so all of these places, you'll notice, are autonomous prefectures, and they'll look very different to the rest of China. Let's do a random street view to prove that. This is what it looks like here. Can you tell we're in China? You can, because of all the ridiculous copycat skyscraper construction. But outside of that, oh man, there's some over here too. Can you really tell? They're building a lot of houses that they might need at some point. And so if we ignore that, okay, this prefecture, we look over here and it's like, yep, this could be the north of Vietnam, or it could be the south of China, right? There's a really interesting blurring of cultures that happens, and this is why so many people have to cross the border, and it's why, something I learned while looking into this video, is if you are Vietnamese, you can actually get a day pass to visit China, which is just kind of fun, because it's not just Lao Cai where you can do it, that's the best example, but there are a few cases where there are, again, medium-sized towns on both sides of the borders here, which means that if we go, and we look at the street view here, look at this. I don't know where I am right now. I'm looking at this isn't what I thought I'd be looking at, but wow, look at this. Isn't this beautiful? The answer is yes, this is beautiful. I think it's absolutely crazy, the kind of crossover in culture you get right there. And so that is, that crossover in culture, combined with the fact that China is one of the world's foremost economic powers, second biggest, you might say, it results in Vietnam being kind of awkwardly squashed. One, because China sometimes, they've had an interesting case over their border, but two, because Vietnam has a big part of the sea as its exclusive economic zone, right? Every country has the legal right to 200 miles, nautical miles, technically, from its coastline to conduct exclusive economic activity. Using that logic, this sea right here is pretty loosely divided between all of the countries in Southeast Asia. Malaysia gets a share, Malaysia over here gets a share, the Philippines gets a share, Brunei gets a small share, and then China gets its little share over here. However, that 200 nautical mile radius is from your nearest piece of land. So obviously, Hainan, this huge island down here, which is one of the closest bits of China to Vietnam, by the way, but this huge island right here extends their zone. And in the same way, I don't know, like Northern Ireland in the UK, or this Newfoundland for Canada, or St. Pierre and Miquelon for France. See, they never let go of territories. I'm telling you, it's the French way, and it's one way of doing colonialism. But interestingly enough, this means that when you look at the border situation, China is desperate to claim the South China Sea. Even the name South China Sea is a bit desperate there. And so there weren't many real islands. There were just kind of some shores here. And so what China's done is they've started building some islands, and they're all very disputed because the natural land, using natural land mass, China's land ends over here, and Vietnam has a border which is very close by. It actually touches Malaysia's, very, very close by to Indonesia, very close by to the Philippines. And so if China is to be believed, then China borders all of these new nations via the sea now, and if anyone else is to be believed, then it's not. But the interesting thing about this, the fun fact that you might know, if you know about the 9-dash line, and the reason why you can't actually see the the territory of, say, Vietnam or one of these countries. One of the interesting facts about that is that it means that China isn't even quite sure what it claims either. The 9-dash line, sometimes called the 11-dash line, is basically China's claim to, like, we own everything roughly over there. They are very ready for there to be a big boom in the area, and they're saying it's ours now just in case. We've made a claim, it's historic now, and so all of this territory that should be Vietnam's, now that's China. All of this territory that should be Malaysia's, now that's China's. And so they have huge border disputes with all of their neighbors, which means that Vietnam and the Philippines agreeing on where their borders end and maybe claiming some of those islands would be very, very upsetting to China, who is a huge partner for everyone in the world. And so Vietnam borders 3 countries, and if you try to ask how many more they border, they'll probably move the conversation on to, oh, have you heard about this new border deal we've got going on? Yeah, we are really modernizing our economy. And to give Vietnam real credit here at the end, I want to say that no other country on earth has, most countries have these really big historical grudges, which just get really dumb at a certain point. Like, if you ever ask people from insert place here, they're like, yeah, I don't trust these people because 100 years ago, their people slaughtered our people, and I still hold a grudge. I cannot tell you the amount of rants I've heard from people in Europe about one other random European ethnicity they just hate everyone in that country for. But Vietnam was, like, bombed to, war crimed, like, 50 years ago? And, they were war crimed by a very big power that was way overwhelming to them. They could have turned this into a story about the US is bad and we are an insular socialist country, but instead, in the name of success, do you know what Vietnamese people actually think about America? 85% of them like it. They love it more than people like Vietnam. Vietnamese people like America more than they like Vietnam or Israel. I'm surprised Israel's at 81, or the Philippines or South Korea or Poland or Nigeria. I'm surprised people in Vietnam have strong opinions about Hungary, Ghana, or Nigeria. But they have these opinions, and it's just one of those incredibly interesting things. The nation has mostly grown and is trying to work on its future rather than its past, and I think that's an incredibly powerful thing, which is why with all these border disputes they just kind of resolve them as fast as they can to be like, okay, tell me more about this one. I get that you have these feelings, but how about instead we work on a big trade treaty? How about they returned Laos some treaties, they returned to Laos some territories via a treaty after the second Indochina conflict. They are very willing to work with their neighbors, and I think that is what makes them one of the successful countries in the area, and honestly, outside of the 5 Asian tigers, one of the most successful places in the region, which is good news if you ask me. But that's why Vietnam is so long and so skinny. It's because it used to be part, the people group. Honestly, if you look at the geography of the whole area, this whole peninsula is very tall and very thin. Like, if you look at Thailand, it gets even thinner here. The whole peninsula is quite, tall, which means that unlike most of the world, where heading east to west makes the most sense, here, it might make the most sense to go north-south, because there's mountains and forests in your way, and so the people groups spread in a very northward direction, and then the people groups were split up by some people with baguettes and cigars, and then those people nowadays live in a country that just to them makes the most sense. And funnily enough, this has some fun benefits, right? Like, I know an example of this I really like. This is not the right map. An example of this I really like is the fact that, like, yeah, for the for their railway network, for example, it's really, really, really easy to plan. It's a straight line country. You don't need to, you get people from one side of the country to the other, boom, job's done. You can go up to these other places, and indeed they do, and eventually across the border to China, but the fact is it's very, very easy to run an entire country that way. Having the population be centered on a corridor actually has some benefits, which, something, the line in Saudi Arabia, something, the way Egypt has, one corridor of population, and something, this has been a second channel video that I hope you all enjoyed, and we'll be diving into the borders of more countries, but I do actually, Vietnam has been very high on my list of countries to visit, and I think now is finally the time, so expect some Vietnamese visit in the not too near future, and let me know in the comments, is Ho Chi Minh City better, or is it Hanoi? Which is the one you gotta go to? I feel like it's really fun whenever a country has this, like, clear split between 2 cities. It's like, which one's the one? With America, it's New York or California. With you know, like China, Shanghai, Beijing. With the UK, I'm just kidding, it's just London. But with Vietnam, the clear question is Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh? Let me know and give me a fun travel anecdote if you've been. And for now, I hope you all enjoyed this video because I'll see you in the next one. Unless there's a tragic house fire. Subscribe if you want to see more stuff, but actually, you know what, don't. This is a second channel video. It's just me over a map. We got some editing in this one, but I assure you, I didn't use the money from this channel. I'm not reinvesting. I'm still using the money for lobster rolls and kebabs. I promise you. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.